qualitative research, purely qualitative research, is observational and descriptive in nature. So it involves using the self as a lens to observe and absorb a context, and then to attempt to both document that and also then to see patterns in what you are observing, and in seeing those patterns then attempt to describe them. As the other Dr. Shenton said, that's often perceived as less rigorous because it is not driven by numbers, necessarily driven by a statistical solution to a problem. But a qualitative researcher would make the claim that it is rigorous in the sense that you do end up getting a sense of patterning, and you do end up getting a sense of validity over time, and especially in anthropology at least, another important method is comparison, right? So seeing how your context is both similar and different to other contexts that other qualitative researchers have put out into the literature. So you're able to see both similarities and differences over time, but it is descriptive in its essence.
And I think with qualitative research you can have, obviously you would have a central question, and this becomes refined over time. You may also have something like a hypothesis as well, that you're thinking through. I think in quantitative research, and I could be wrong because it's not something that I do all of the time, but you're more likely to have a set of hypotheses that you are testing, and you might accept or reject them, right? So.
It's also narrow. Quantitative analysis, I worked in neuropsychology for a while too, and so it's a very different beast in the sense that you are trying to, what's the word I'm looking for? You are trying to subtract out all of the extraneous variables, right? The idea is not one about context and about understanding something in context. It's about isolating a variable and looking at the ways in which that variable changes as a function of other parameters, right? And if you're doing that, you can say something about the function of a variable, but you can't say about anything about how that variable functions in a context. And so that's a major difference. When I'm talking about trade-offs, you can just see different things if you're taking context into account versus not taking context into account. And we tend to see, this is maybe a political claim, but we tend to see rigorous science as being one in which you are answering a very narrow problem. A qualitative researcher will come to that and say, well, yeah, but what about everything else, right? And anthropologists are constantly saying, well, what about everything else?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that anthropologists do mixed methods, right? We do have folks who do qualitative and quantitative work. We did that when we did our field work in Ecuador. So I did a lot of participant observation, which is spending time with people in a place, learning about them through observing and doing. And I also did interviews. But at the same time, I did some surveys where I asked them to identify, for instance, the body that they had on a particular scale and compare that to maybe bodies that are aspirational, and I assessed the gap and statistical significance of the difference between their ideal body and their actual body. And so people do that all the time, and numbers do give you different ways of talking about the conclusions that you draw for your data, but then when you supplement that as well, actually I would say that I supplemented my qualitative research with my quantitative. So my project was by and large qualitative, right? But having those numbers let me say certain kinds of things that I couldn't say with qualitative data alone.
And I did the same thing with my dissertation research. I was also doing participant observation. My questions were about ecological knowledge of the local forest and the ways in which those were changing in eastern Ecuador for young indigenous youths. And so I spent a lot of time going with people and walking with them to their farms and talking with them about farming practices, their aspirations for work in eco-lodges, that kind of a thing. But also, I had a whole series of surveys that were just looking at the sheer numbers of how people thought about and what they knew about species in the local forest and about how they valued those relative to different sorts of ideals. And those were the patterns that I could actually see and then link to the qualitative observations of how people were thinking and aspiring and wanting to do new kinds of things.